Everyone rushed past the man in the wheelchair like he was invisible. The only person who stopped was a schoolgirl in worn-out shoes. When the black SUV appeared the next day, nobody expected what happened next. Sarah Johnson's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., vibrating against the scratched surface of her bedside table. She quickly silenced it, glancing at the thin wall separating her room from her mother's. The familiar sound of deep breathing from the other side told her that her mom was finally asleep after another 12-hour hospital shift. The wooden floor creaked under her feet as she made her way to the bathroom. Their small apartment in suburban Boston barely had enough space for the two of them, but they made it work. Sarah caught her reflection in the cracked mirror, a tall, lanky 13-year-old with her dark hair pulled back in neat braids her mother had done 2 days ago. Just another day, she whispered to herself, careful to keep her voice down. The kitchen counter held last night's dishes, which she'd been too tired to wash after finishing her homework. Sarah filled the sink with warm water, adding a tiny squeeze of the almost empty dish soap bottle. The bills scattered across the kitchen table caught her eye, red stamps marking several as past due in bold letters. Her old flip phone lay next to her backpack, its screen flickering occasionally. Yesterday in class, Madison Thompson had laughed when she'd pulled it out to check the time. "Is that a museum piece?" Madison had asked, waving her latest iPhone. "My dad gets me a new one every year." Sarah picked up her phone, running her thumb over the worn keypad. 3 years ago, it had been her father's. 3 years ago, before he'd walked out without saying goodbye, leaving nothing but this phone and a stack of unpaid bills behind. A sharp knock at the front door made her jump. Sarah crept to the entrance and peered through the peephole. Mr. Rivera, their landlord, was taping something to the door. She waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before opening it. The notice was printed on bright yellow paper. Rent increase effective next month. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the new amount. $200 more than they were already struggling to pay. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. Her mother didn't need to see this right after her shift. Not when Sarah had heard her crying again last night. Those muffled sobs that leaked through the wall when she thought Sarah was asleep. The microwave clock showed 6:15 a.m. Sarah pulled out 2 eggs and the half-empty loaf of bread. She made breakfast for herself and prepared a plate for her mother to heat up later. The toast was slightly burnt. They needed a new toaster, but that was just another item on the growing list of things they couldn't afford. Opening the fridge, Sarah counted the remaining items. 3 eggs, half a gallon of milk, some lettuce that was starting to wilt, and 2 chicken breasts that needed to be cooked today. She'd have to figure out how to stretch that into dinner for the next 2 nights. Her mother's nursing scrubs hung on the drying rack in the corner, still damp from last night's quick wash. Sarah touched the rough fabric, remembering how proud she'd felt when her mom had graduated from nursing school 2 years ago. They'd thought things would get easier then. Instead, the bills kept piling up and the hours got longer. The sound of shifting springs came from her mother's room, followed by a quiet sigh. Sarah froze, but the apartment fell silent again. Her mother needed every minute of sleep she could get before her next shift. Sarah packed her backpack, double-checking that she had completed all her homework. Her textbooks were secondhand, the pages marked with other students' highlights and notes. She'd covered the previous owners' names with her own label, property of Sarah Johnson, written in careful block letters. The clock now read 6:45 a.m. She needed to leave in 15 minutes to catch the city bus that would take her to school. Sarah pulled out her notebook and wrote a quick note. "Mom, made you breakfast in the microwave. Don't forget to eat. Have a good rest. Love you." She placed the note next to the covered plate and gathered her things. The rent increase notice felt heavy in her pocket, but she pushed that worry aside. Right now, she needed to focus on getting through another day at school. Sarah slipped on her worn sneakers, the ones she'd carefully cleaned last weekend to hide how the soles were starting to separate. Madison and her friends wore new Nikes and Adidas, but Sarah had mastered the art of walking in a way that kept her shoes from making that slight flapping sound. Just before leaving, she heard it, the faint sound of sniffling from her mother's room. Sarah stood still, her hand on the doorknob, as the muffled crying continued. She wanted to go in, to hug her mother and tell her everything would be okay. Instead, she did what she always did, pretended not to hear, just like her mother pretended everything was fine during the day. Sarah closed the apartment door as quietly as possible, making sure it was locked before heading toward the bus stop. The early morning air was crisp, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. She joined a small group of people waiting for the 7 a.m. bus. Other students, cleaning staff, construction workers, all of them carrying the same tired expression she saw in her mirror every morning. The rent notice crinkled in her pocket as she sat down on the cold metal bench. Sarah pulled it out and read it again, the numbers burning into her memory. $200 might as well have been $2 million. She folded the paper into a tiny square and tucked it away again. Her mother would find out eventually, but not today. Not after another exhausting night shift. Not when they were both barely holding on to what little stability they had. The city bus appeared at the corner, its brakes squealing as it approached the stop. Sarah stood up, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders. As she climbed aboard, she pushed all thoughts of bills and rent increases and crying mothers to the back of her mind. She had a math test first period, and she couldn't afford to let anything distract her from maintaining her grades. Her mother always said education was their ticket to a better life, and Sarah was determined not to let her down. The school bus lurched to a stop in front of Boston East Public High School. Sarah joined the stream of students flowing through the main entrance, keeping to the edge of the crowd. The hallways smelled of floor cleaner and teenage anxiety, with clusters of students gathered around lockers decorated for upcoming birthdays and sports events. "Oh my God, look at this!" Madison Thompson's voice carried over the hallway noise as she showed off her new Apple Watch to her friends. "Daddy got it for me just because I aced my history quiz." Sarah kept her head down as she passed the group, but Madison's eyes caught her anyway. "Hey, Sarah," still rocking that vintage phone. The group's laughter followed Sarah to her locker. Her locker neighbor, James Chun, gave her a sympathetic smile. "Don't let them get to you," he said, pulling out his chemistry textbook. Madison's dad probably bought her that watch to make up for missing her ballet recital. Again, Sarah managed a small nod but didn't respond. Her own father hadn't even sent a birthday card in 3 years. At least Madison's father tried to show he cared, even if it was with expensive gifts. The first period bell rang, and Sarah hurried to Mr. Peterson's math class. She pulled out her calculator, an old TI-83 she'd borrowed from the math department, and placed it carefully on her desk. Around her, other students produced newer models with color screens and advanced functions. "Remember, you have 45 minutes for this test," Mr. Peterson announced, passing out the papers. "And no, Miss Thompson, you cannot use your smart watch as a calculator." Sarah focused on the test, pushing everything else aside. Numbers were safe. They didn't care what kind of phone you had or which part of Boston you lived in. 2 plus 2 equaled 4, whether you wore Nikes or knockoffs. The questions weren't easy, but Sarah had studied hard. She'd stayed up late reviewing formulas while her mother worked the night shift, using the flickering kitchen light because the better bulbs were too expensive to replace right now. "Time's up," Mr. Peterson called. Sarah handed in her test, confident she'd done well. She needed to maintain her GPA if she wanted any chance at a scholarship in a few years. Third period was ethics and social responsibility with Ms. Rodriguez. Today's topic was community service and social impact. Sarah sat in her usual spot near the window, watching as Ms. Rodriguez wrote on the whiteboard. "Who can tell me why community service matters?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, scanning the classroom. Madison's hand shot up. "My daddy says it looks good on college applications." "While that's true," Ms. Rodriguez said carefully, "there are more important reasons." "Anyone else?" Sarah thought about her mother, working extra shifts to help patients who couldn't afford their medical bills. She thought about Mr. Chun from the corner store, who sometimes slipped extra groceries into their bag when money was tight. But she kept her hand down. "Community service is about recognizing our shared humanity," Ms. Rodriguez continued. "It's about seeing someone in need and choosing to help, not because it benefits us, but because it's the right thing to do." The words settled in Sarah's chest as she took notes in her worn notebook. Around her, half the class was secretly checking their phones under their desks. Lunch period came, and Sarah found her usual spot in the cafeteria corner. She pulled out her sandwich, peanut butter on slightly stale bread, and opened her math textbook. Studying during lunch meant one less thing to do at home. "Sarah?" Ms. Rodriguez appeared beside her table. Do you have a moment? Sarah nodded, quickly swallowing her bite of sandwich. I wanted to talk to you about your last essay, Ms. Rodriguez said, sitting down. Your analysis of social inequality was incredibly insightful. Have you considered joining the school's debate team? I can't, Sarah said quietly. I need to be home after school to help my mom. Ms. Rodriguez's expression softened. I understand. But Sarah, you have real potential. Don't let circumstances limit your dreams, easy for her to say, Sarah thought. Dreams didn't pay the rent or put food on the table. The afternoon dragged through world history and chemistry. In English class, they were reading The Great Gatsby, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how her classmates swooned over the parties and the wealth while missing the point about the emptiness of it all. Final bell rang at 3:15 p.m. Sarah packed her bag quickly, wanting to avoid the usual after-school crowd. She had to walk through the financial district to catch her bus home, and she preferred to do it before the evening rush when the streets filled with executives leaving their glass tower offices. Sarah, James called out as she reached the school entrance. Want to study together at the library? They're keeping it open late now. Sorry, I can't, Sarah replied. Maybe another time. She started her walk, passing boutique shops with price tags that made her dizzy. A group of private school students crowded around a bubble tea shop, their uniforms crisp and identical. Sarah wondered what it felt like to not have to think about money all the time. The financial district loomed ahead, all steel and glass reaching toward the sky. Men and women in expensive suits rushed past her on the sidewalk, many talking rapidly into their AirPods about stocks and meetings and profit margins. Their shoes probably cost more than her mother made in a week. Sarah checked her old phone, 3:45 p.m. If she hurried, she could catch the 4:15 bus home. She needed to start dinner before her mother left for her shift at 6 p.m. The chicken in the fridge wouldn't last another day. The crowd grew thicker as she approached the heart of the financial district. Sarah weaved through the forest of suits and briefcases, trying to make herself invisible. These people lived in a different world, one where rent increases didn't mean choosing between electricity and food. That's when she saw him, an elderly man in a wheelchair, trying to get someone's attention at the crosswalk. People streamed past him as if he were part of the street furniture, their eyes fixed on phones or straight ahead. Sarah stopped walking. The man's white hair caught the afternoon sun, and his blue button-down shirt looked soft and worn, like it had been washed many times. His wheelchair was positioned at an awkward angle to the curb, and she could see him struggling to get it properly aligned. She glanced at her phone again. 3:52 p.m. The bus would come in 23 minutes. If she helped him now, she might miss it and have to wait another 30 minutes for the next one. That would mean dinner would be late, and her mother would worry. But as Sarah watched another businessman nearly clip the wheelchair with his briefcase, she remembered Ms. Rodriguez's words from class. It's about seeing someone in need and choosing to help, not because it benefits us, but because it's the right thing to do. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. Sarah's sneakers scuffed against the concrete as she approached the elderly man in the wheelchair. Up close, she noticed the deep lines around his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly on the wheelchair's armrests. "Excuse me, sir?" Her voice came out quieter than intended. "Do you need help crossing?" The man turned, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Oh, thank goodness. I've been trying to get someone's attention for 10 minutes. His voice was warm but tired. "I'm Richard Thompson, but everyone calls me Dick." "I'm Sarah," she replied, glancing at the surge of people around them. "Which way are you trying to go?" "Just across to the other side. My driver's supposed to meet me there, but this curb is giving me trouble." He gestured to where his wheelchair was caught at an awkward angle. Sarah looked at the crosswalk signal, solid red hand. A stream of suits and briefcases rushed past, their shoes click-clacking against the pavement. Her phone showed 3:55 p.m. "Young lady," Mr. Thompson said, noting her hesitation, "if you're busy, don't worry about an old man like me. Someone else will help eventually." But Sarah had watched enough people walk past to know that wasn't true. She squared her shoulders and moved behind his wheelchair. "I can help. We just need to wait for the next signal." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "Always ask before touching someone's wheelchair." Sarah cleared her throat. Is it okay if I adjust your chair, Mr. Thompson? He nodded, smiling. You've done this before? No, sir. But my grandmother taught me about being respectful. Sarah carefully repositioned the wheelchair parallel to the curb. A businessman brushed past so close that his briefcase knocked against the wheelchair's wheel. Hey, Sarah called after him. But he was already gone, lost in the crowd of identical suits. Don't waste your breath, Mr. Thompson chuckled, but the sound held no humor. They've been doing that all afternoon. It's like I'm invisible. Sarah checked her phone again. 3:58 p.m. The 4:15 bus was definitely not happening now. Her mother would worry if she wasn't home at the usual time. She should have just walked past like everyone else. The crosswalk signal changed to walk. Sarah gripped the wheelchair handles. Ready, Mr. Thompson? Ready as I'll ever be. She pushed forward, but the front wheels caught on the curb. Mr. Thompson jerked in his seat. Sorry. Sarah adjusted her angle and tried again. This time, the wheelchair rolled smoothly off the curb. They were halfway across when the countdown timer started. 15, 14, 13, we've got plenty of time, Mr. Thompson said calmly, but Sarah could see cars inching forward, drivers drumming fingers on steering wheels. 10, 9, 8, a taxi honked. Sarah's hands tightened on the handles. She wanted to rush, but she remembered her grandmother's words. Slow is smooth, and smooth is safe. 5, 4, 3. They reached the other curb just as the light changed. A car accelerated past, the wind from its passage tugging at Sarah's clothes. That wasn't so bad, was it? Mr. Thompson said, but Sarah noticed his knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests. She looked for the driver he'd mentioned, but the sidewalk held only more hurrying business people. A man in an expensive dark suit stood nearby, watching them intently. When he caught Sarah looking, he turned away and spoke into his phone. My driver seems to be running late, Mr. Thompson sighed. Would you mind waiting with me for a few minutes? I'd feel better not being alone here. Sarah's phone showed 4:05 p.m. The next bus wouldn't come until 4:45. Her mother would definitely notice her late arrival now. I can stay, she said, moving to stand where she could block the worst of the pedestrian traffic from hitting his wheelchair. Tell me, Sarah, Mr. Thompson said, why did you stop when no one else would? The question caught her off guard. She watched a young woman in high heels sidestep around them without breaking her phone conversation. I don't know, Sarah admitted. It just seemed wrong not to. Mr. Thompson adjusted his position in the wheelchair. You know what I've learned sitting here today? People aren't necessarily bad. They're just busy, wrapped up in their own problems they've trained themselves not to see. A gust of wind swept down the street, carrying the smell of car exhaust and a nearby coffee shop. Sarah pulled her thin jacket tighter. Are you cold? Mr. Thompson asked. My driver should be here any minute. Charlie's never been this late before. I'm okay, Sarah said, though her fingers were getting numb from the wind. She checked her phone again, 4:12 p.m. Maybe she could call her mother, explain why she'd be late. But that would mean telling her about helping Mr. Thompson, and her mother would worry about her talking to strangers. The man in the dark suit was still there, pretending to read something on his phone while stealing glances at them. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Thompson, there's a man watching us. Oh. He turned his head slightly. Don't worry about him. Probably just another busy executive with nowhere to be. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The man's attention felt different from the indifference of the passing crowd. He seemed to be waiting for something. Sarah, Mr. Thompson's voice had grown serious. Why were you walking through the financial district? Most kids your age would be hanging out at the mall or something. It's my route home from school, she said, then added without thinking, it's the cheapest bus line. Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. You seem very responsible for your age. Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. A group of junior executives pushed past them, laughing about happy hour plans. One of them was wearing a watch that looked just like Madison's new one. Do you need to be somewhere? Mr. Thompson asked. I notice you keep checking your phone. It's fine, Sarah said, but her voice betrayed her worry. My mom just expects me home by now. Ah. He was quiet for a moment. Single parent? Sarah nodded before she could stop herself. Something about Mr. Thompson made her want to be honest. That must be hard, he said softly. For both of you? The man in the dark suit was speaking into his phone again, this time more urgently. Sarah watched him gesture toward them with his free hand. "Mr. Thompson," she started, "are you sure your driver is coming? Maybe we should call someone?" "Oh, he'll be here," Mr. Thompson said with unexpected certainty. "And Sarah? Thank you. Not just for helping me cross the street, but for staying, for seeing me when others wouldn't." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the gratitude in his voice. She wasn't used to adults speaking to her like she mattered. A black SUV turned the corner, moving slowly through the traffic. The man in the dark suit straightened, putting his phone away. "Ah," Mr. Thompson smiled. "There's Charlie now. Right on time." Sarah frowned. "But you said he was late?" Mr. Thompson just smiled, his eyes twinkling with something that looked like satisfaction. The SUV pulled up to the curb. The black SUV's windows were tinted so dark that Sarah couldn't see inside. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, opening the passenger door with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Thompson," he said, nodding respectfully. "Everything is ready." Sarah's hand tightened on the wheelchair handle. Something wasn't adding up. The suited man she'd thought was watching them was part of Mr. Thompson's team. "Sarah," Mr. Thompson turned to her, "would you mind helping me into the vehicles?" She glanced at her phone. 4:25 p.m. Her mother would be waking up soon, getting ready for her evening shift. The rent increase notice crinkled in her pocket as she shifted her weight. "I can take it from here," the suited man said, reaching for the wheelchair. "No, James," Mr. Thompson raised his hand. "Let the young lady help. She's gotten me this far." Sarah swallowed hard. More men in suits had appeared, forming a loose circle around them. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "If something doesn't feel right, trust your gut." "Actually, I should probably go," she said, taking a step back. "My mom will be worried." "Please," Mr. Thompson's voice was gentle. "Just 5 more minutes. I promise you won't regret it." A woman rushed past them, her heels clicking on the pavement. "Move that circus off the sidewalk," she snapped, barely looking up from her phone. Sarah felt her face flush with anger. "Excuse me," she called after the woman, "but we're helping someone here." The woman didn't even pause. "See?" Mr. Thompson chuckled, still standing up for the invisible man. "You're quite something, Sarah Johnson." Sarah froze. "I never told you my last name." The suited man, James, cleared his throat. "Sir, we're attracting attention." Mr. Thompson nodded. "Sarah, I know you're nervous, but I also know your mother, Lisa Johnson, is working the night shift at Boston General. She won't be checking for you just yet." Sarah's heart pounded. She looked around at the suited men, at the expensive SUV, and Mr. Thompson's suddenly shrewd expression. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching how people behave when they think nobody important is looking." He gestured to the street around them. "Do you know how many people have walked past the spot today?" Sarah shook her head. "Thousands," he said. "Business executives, lawyers, bankers. People who make more money in a month than most families see in a year." "And do you know how many stopped to help an old man in a wheelchair?" "Just me." Sarah's voice came out small. "Just you?" Mr. Thompson's eyes crinkled. "Though I saw plenty of them donate to charities at their fancy galas. It's easy to be generous when everyone's watching." A cool wind whipped down the street. Sarah shivered, acutely aware of her worn jacket and scuffed shoes. "Sir," James said quietly, "the board meeting." "Yes, yes." Mr. Thompson waved them off. "Sarah, would you help an old man into his car? Then we can explain everything." Sarah looked at the SUV, then at her phone. 4:30 p.m. The smart thing would be to run, to catch the next bus, to forget this strange encounter. But Mr. Thompson was still smiling at her, patient and kind, just like he'd been when everyone else rushed past. She thought about what her mother always said. Kindness costs nothing, but means everything. "Okay," she said. "What do you need me to do?" James moved to help, but Mr. Thompson waved him back. "Sarah knows how to do this properly. Don't you, dear?" Sarah positioned the wheelchair at the correct angle to the SUV's open door. "I need to lock the brakes," she explained, demonstrating. "And make sure the footrests are up." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. "You see, James? That's what respect looks like." Sarah helped Mr. Thompson stand, supporting his weight as he pivoted into the vehicle. His strength surprised her. He was steadier on his feet than he'd appeared. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, settling into the leather seat. Now, would you join me for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss. Sarah stepped back. I really should go. It's about your mother's job at the hospital, and that rent increase notice in your pocket. Sarah's hand flew to her jacket. How did you dash? I make it my business to know things, Mr. Thompson said, especially about people who show genuine kindness in a world that increasingly lacks it. Another suited man opened the car's other door. The leather interior looked soft and warm, and Sarah caught the faint smell of something expensive, like the perfume samples in magazines she could never afford. 5 minutes, Mr. Thompson promised. Then James will drive you home himself if you wish. Sarah looked at her phone one last time. 4:35 p.m. The next bus wouldn't come for 10 minutes anyway. Okay, she said, climbing into the SUV. 5 minutes? The door closed behind her with a solid thunk, sealing them in silence. The street noise faded to a distant hum. Now then, Mr. Thompson said, his voice taking on a different tone, sharper, more focused. Let me tell you who I really am, and why I spent my afternoon sitting in a wheelchair on a busy street in the financial district. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap as Mr. Thompson reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. The card was thick, cream-colored, with simple black text. Richard Thompson, CEO, Thompson Healthcare International. Sarah's eyes widened. Thompson Healthcare International owned the hospital where her mother worked. You're Madison's grandfather, she whispered. Mr. Thompson's eyebrows rose. You know my granddaughter? We go to school together, Sarah said, remembering Madison's new Apple Watch. She just got a new watch for acing her history test. Yes, Mr. Thompson sighed. Her father's solution to everything. Buy her affection, since he never has time to give her attention. He straightened in his seat. But we're not here to talk about Madison. We're here to talk about you, Sarah Johnson, and why you were the only person in the financial district who stopped to help a stranger. Outside, the suits continued their endless parade, unaware of the conversation happening behind the SUV's tinted windows. Sarah watched them hurry past, wondering how many of them worked for the man sitting next to her. Sir, she said carefully, I should really call my mom? Your mother is still sleeping, Mr. Thompson said. I confirmed her schedule with the hospital. And Sarah, what I'm about to offer you could change both your lives. The leather seat creaked as Sarah shifted uncomfortably. The business card in her hand felt heavy, its embossed letters catching the afternoon light filtering through the tinted windows. Let me be direct, Mr. Thompson said, turning to face her fully. I've been watching how my company treats people at every level, from janitors to executives, patients to doctors. Do you know what I've learned? Sarah shook her head, still staring at the business card. Money changes people, usually not for the better. He gestured to the street outside. Take your mother's supervisor. Dr. Williams makes $500,000 a year, drives a Tesla, lives in Beacon Hill. Yet he denies overtime to nurses working double shifts. Sarah's head snapped up. How did you know about Dash, about your mother's overtime being rejected? I know everything that happens in my hospitals. Mr. Thompson's face hardened. Just like I know she's been picking up extra shifts to cover for understaffed departments. Without compensation. Through the windshield, Sarah watched another wave of executives flood the crosswalk, their faces buried in phones. Your mother, Mr. Thompson continued, works harder than any doctor in that hospital. But the system is rigged against people like her. People who care more about helping others than helping themselves. A knock on the window made Sarah jump. James stood outside, holding up 5 fingers. Mr. Thompson nodded. The board is waiting. Sarah, I'm going to make this simple. I want to offer your mother a new position. Director of Nursing Operations, reporting directly to me. Triple her current salary, full benefits, flexible hours. Sarah's breath caught. What? And for you, a full scholarship to any school of your choice. Private, public, whatever you prefer. Plus a college fund that will cover any university in the country. The rent increase notice crinkled in Sarah's pocket. She thought about her mother's exhausted face, the mounting bills, the empty fridge. Why? She managed to ask. Because you proved something to me today. Mr. Thompson straightened his tie. I've spent 40 years building this company, watching it grow into a healthcare giant. But somewhere along the way, we lost our humanity. We stopped seeing people as people. Another knock. James looked increasingly anxious. Mr. Thompson, Sarah started, this is too much. We can't can't what? Accept help? Let me tell you something about pride, Sarah. It's worthless when it keeps good people down. He pulled out a phone, the latest iPhone model, and pulled up a photo. This was me 50 years ago. The photo showed a young man in worn clothes, standing in front of a small drugstore. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through pharmacy school. Thought I had to do everything alone to prove my worth. You know what changed? Sarah shook her head. Someone saw me. Really saw me. Gave me a chance when I needed it most. He put the phone away. Today, you saw me when hundreds walked past. Now I'm seeing you. The street lights were coming on outside. Sarah's phone showed 5:15 p.m. Her mother would be awake by now. Sarah swallowed hard. I need to talk to my mom about this. Of course. Mr. Thompson handed her an envelope. All the details are in here. Salary, benefits, scholarship information. Take it home. Discuss it. But Sarah? His eyes turned serious. Don't let pride stop you from accepting help. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we can't do everything alone. James opened Sarah's door. The evening air rushed in, carrying the smell of exhaust and nearby food carts. One more thing, Mr. Thompson said as she stepped out. The position starts Monday. If your mother accepts, you'll never have to worry about rent increases again. Sarah clutched the envelope to her chest. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. No, Sarah. Thank you for reminding an old man what this company was built for. He smiled. James will drive you home now. And Sarah, tell your mother I'm sorry about Dr. Williams. He won't be denying any more overtime requests. The drive home passed in a blur. Sarah sat in the back of the SUV, the envelope warm in her hands, watching familiar streets through unfamiliar tinted windows. James didn't speak, but she caught him glancing at her in the rearview mirror. They pulled up to her apartment building just as the sun was setting. The cracked concrete steps and graffiti-tagged walls looked different somehow. Temporary, like a stage set about to be struck. Miss Johnson, James said as she reached for the door handle. Mr. Thompson doesn't do this kind of thing. Ever. Whatever he saw in you today, it must have been special. Sarah stepped out onto the sidewalk. Through the building's thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez on the 3rd floor playing her evening novellas. Someone's baby was crying on the 2nd floor. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, but they seemed to be coming from a different world now. The SUV pulled away as Sarah climbed the stairs to her apartment. She could hear movement inside. Her mother was awake, probably getting ready for her shift. Sarah touched the envelope in her pocket, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Her mother stood in the kitchen, hair still wet from her shower, already dressed in her scrubs. Sarah? You're late. I was worried, She stopped, noticing her daughter's expression. What's wrong? What happened? Sarah pulled out the envelope. Mom, you should sit down. There's something I need to tell you about a man I met today. Lisa Johnson sank into one of their mismatched kitchen chairs, the envelope unopened in her trembling hands. Start from the beginning, she said, her voice tight with worry. Who exactly did you meet? Sarah stood by the kitchen counter, her backpack still on her shoulders. His name is Richard Thompson. He's the CEO of your hospital. The color drained from her mother's face. Sarah, what did you do? I just helped him cross the street. The words tumbled out. He was in a wheelchair, and nobody would stop, and I remembered what Grandma always said about helping people, and slowed down. Lisa put the envelope on the table like it might bite. Richard Thompson, the CEO, was in a wheelchair. On your way home from school, he was testing people, Sarah explained, seeing if anyone would help. And I was the only one who stopped. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbor's TV playing the evening news. And now he wants to give me a job? Lisa's voice was skeptical. Just because you helped him cross the street? Sarah grabbed the business card from her pocket. Here, this is his card. And James, his driver, brought me home in their SUV. It's real, Mom. All of it. Lisa studied the card, running her finger over the embossed letters. Sarah, things like this, they don't just happen. Not to people like us. Why not? Sarah's voice cracked. Why can't something good happen to us for once? Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Baby, I dash no, Mom. Listen. Sarah pulled out the rent increase notice. I found this on the door this morning. I was going to tell you, but we can't afford it, can we? Lisa took the yellow paper, her hands shaking. $200? But how? Mr. Thompson is offering you 3 times your current salary, Sarah said quietly. Plus benefits. And a scholarship for me. A scholarship? For any school. In college, too. Sarah moved to the table, sitting across from her mother. He said it's because you work harder than anyone at the hospital. He knows about Dr. Williams denying your overtime. Lisa's head snapped up. How did he dash? He knows everything that happens there. And he wants to make it right. The kitchen fell silent again. Lisa stared at the envelope, then at the rent increase notice, then back at the envelope. Mom, Sarah said softly, remember what you always tell me about how education is our way out? That's different. That's about working hard, earning your way dash. Isn't that what you've been doing? Working doubles, picking up extra shifts, covering for everyone else? Sarah leaned forward. Maybe this is what earning it looks like. A siren wailed in the distance. Lisa glanced at the clock. She should have left for her shift 10 minutes ago. I have to call in, she muttered, reaching for her phone. Tell them I'll be late. Actually, Sarah hesitated. Mr. Thompson said Dr. Williams won't be denying overtime anymore. He seemed pretty sure about that. Lisa's laugh came out shaky. Of course he did. She finally picked up the envelope, breaking the seal carefully. Sarah watched her mother's face as she read the documents inside. Her eyes widened at the salary figure. Her hands trembled at the benefits package. When she reached the scholarship information, tears spilled onto the paper. This is real, she whispered. This is actually real. Does that mean you'll take it? Lisa looked up at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing the hope in her eyes, the weight of responsibility on her young shoulders. Sarah, she said slowly, do you understand what happened today? Really understand? Sarah thought about Mr. Thompson in his wheelchair, about Madison's expensive watch, about all the people who walked past without seeing. I think, she said carefully, sometimes being kind is more important than being rich or powerful. And sometimes powerful people notice that. Lisa wiped her eyes. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. Sarah managed a small smile. So, Monday? Her mother looked around their small kitchen, at the flickering light, the stack of bills, the nearly empty fridge. Then she looked at the papers in her hands, at the future they offered. Monday, she agreed, her voice stronger. But Sarah? Promise me something. What? Promise me you'll never change. Never stop seeing people who need help, no matter what happens. Sarah thought about Mr. Thompson's words in the SUV. Money changes people. Usually not for the better. I promise, Mom. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand. We'll still be us. Just us with less worrying. Lisa squeezed her hand. I need to make some calls. Let work know I won't be in tonight. And tomorrow. She took a deep breath. Tomorrow we look for a new apartment. One closer to your school. Can we get one with working heat? Working heat, working lights, maybe even a dishwasher. Lisa stood up, straightening her shoulders. But first I need to call Richard Thompson. She picked up her phone, then paused. Sarah? Thank you for being the kind of person who stops to help. For being better than I ever dreamed you'd be. Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. Mom! A knock at the door made them both jump. Lisa opened it to find James standing there, still in his dark suit. Ms. Johnson, he said formally. Mr. Thompson asked me to wait and ensure you receive the documents. He's expecting your call. Lisa looked down at her phone, then at the papers in her hand, then at her daughter. Yes, she said, her voice firm. Tell him I'm calling right now. And James? Thank him for seeing my daughter today. For really seeing her. James smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. That's exactly what he said about her seeing him. Sarah watched her mother dial the number from the business card, watched her hands steady as she raised the phone to her ear. Mr. Thompson? This is Lisa Johnson. Yes, she did. And sir? I accept. Sarah woke up to sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then she remembered yesterday. Mr. Thompson, the wheelchair, the offer, her mother's phone call. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Sarah frowned. Her mother should be sleeping after her night shift. Mom? She padded out of her room in sock feet. Lisa Johnson sat at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas, a stack of papers spread in front of her. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes and a smile Sarah hadn't seen in years. "Good morning, baby." She gestured to a plate of fresh bagels. "James dropped these off an hour ago. With some paperwork I need to sign." Sarah picked up a bagel, still warm, from that expensive bakery downtown where a single bagel cost more than their usual loaf of bread. "You didn't go to work last night?" Mr. Thompson insisted I take the rest of the week off. "Paid leave?" Lisa shook her head in disbelief. "He wants me fresh for Monday." A car horn honked outside. Sarah went to the window and froze. A black SUV, different from yesterday's, but just as expensive, sat idling at their curb. "That's for us," Lisa said, gathering the papers. "We're looking at apartments today. Mr. Thompson's real estate team found some options." Sarah nearly choked on her bagel. "Real estate team?" "Apparently, it's part of the relocation package." Lisa straightened her shoulders. "I told them nothing too fancy. We don't need much, just working heat." Sarah grinned. "And no rats in the walls?" Lisa checked her watch, a new one, Sarah noticed, replacing the dollar store model she'd worn for years. "Get dressed. The agent is waiting." 20 minutes later, they sat in the back of the SUV, a woman in a crisp suit sitting across from them with a tablet. "I'm Amanda Chun from Thompson Corporate Housing," she said, swiping through floor plans. "We've selected several options within your preferred budget and location requirements." Sarah watched the neighborhood scroll past the window. They were heading toward the better part of town, where the sidewalks were clean and trees lined the streets. "This first property is a 2-bedroom in Brighton," Amanda explained. "Walking distance to Boston East Public, so Sarah won't need to change schools." The SUV pulled up to a red brick building with a small courtyard. No graffiti on the walls. No broken steps. Just neat rows of windows with actual flower boxes. "It's too much," Lisa whispered as they followed Amanda inside. "We can't dash, Mom," Sarah interrupted. "Remember what Mr. Thompson said about pride?" The apartment was on the 3rd floor. Amanda unlocked the door and stepped back, letting them enter first. Sarah's breath caught. Sunlight poured through large windows, illuminating hardwood floors. No creaky boards, no worn patches. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances, including a dishwasher. 2 bedrooms, each with its own closet. A bathroom with no leaky faucet, no cracked tiles. "The rent is within the housing allowance provided in your contract," Amanda said, noting Lisa's expression. "And it's available immediately." Lisa ran her hand along the kitchen counter. "But our lease dash has been taken care of. Mr. Thompson's legal team handled it this morning." Sarah wandered into one of the bedrooms. It was bigger than her current one, with a window seat overlooking the courtyard. She could already picture her books there. Imagine studying without hearing the neighbors' TV through the walls. "There are other properties to see," Amanda began, but Lisa cut her off. "No," she said quietly. "This one, it's perfect." Amanda's professional smile softened. "I'll start the paperwork." They spent the next hour signing documents. Sarah sat on the window seat, watching movers arrive with boxes. "Everything will be packed and moved by tonight," Amanda explained. Mr. Thompson was quite insistent about the timeline. Lisa's pen paused. "But our things, they're not exactly, are being supplemented with necessary items," Mr. Thompson's orders. Amanda pulled out another document. "Which brings me to the next matter. Sarah's scholarship." Sarah's head snapped up. Lisa gripped the pen tighter. "The educational trust has been established," Amanda continued. "It covers full tuition at any private or public school of your choice, plus a college fund for any university in the country." "But I want to stay at Boston East," Sarah said quickly. "My friends?" Amanda nodded. "Of course. The funds can also cover extracurriculars, tutoring, supplies, whatever you need." Lisa signed the final paper with trembling hands. "I don't know how to thank him." "Actually," Amanda checked her tablet, "Mr. Thompson would like to thank you both in person. He's requested your presence at his office tomorrow morning." The office, where her mother would be working, where everything had changed because Sarah had stopped to help an old man cross the street. A knock at the door made them all turn. James stood there, his dark suit as immaculate as ever. "Ms. Johnson," he said formally, "the movers are ready." And he hesitated. "There's someone else here to see you." A figure appeared behind him, a tall man in hospital scrubs. Dr. Williams, Lisa's supervisor. His face was pale, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, "could we speak privately?" Amanda and James exchanged looks. "We'll give you a moment," Amanda said, ushering Sarah toward the door. But Lisa stood up. "No." Sarah stays. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of my daughter." Dr. Williams swallowed hard. I owe you an apology. The way I've treated you, the overtime denials, the extra shifts, it was unprofessional. And wrong. Mr. Thompson spoke to you, Lisa said. It wasn't a question. He made some things very clear. Dr. Williams straightened his white coat. "Your new position. You've earned it. More than earned it. I just wanted you to know that." Lisa nodded once, her expression neutral. "Is that all?" He glanced at Sarah, then back to Lisa. "Yes, that's all. Good luck, Lisa." He left quickly, almost bumping into James in the doorway. "Well," Amanda said brightly, "shall we discuss the moving schedules?" But Sarah wasn't listening. She was watching her mother, seeing her stand taller, seeing the weight of years of disrespect finally lift from her shoulders. "Mom," she said softly, "are you okay?" Lisa turned to her daughter, tears and triumph mixing in her eyes. "I'm better than okay. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I should be." Outside, the movers began bringing in boxes of new furniture. Amanda discussed paint colors and window treatments. James coordinated the moving teams with quiet efficiency. And Sarah stood at her new window seat, watching it all unfold, remembering Mr. Thompson's words. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we can't do everything alone. The Thompson Healthcare International building rose 70 stories into the Boston skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Sarah stood beside her mother in the lobby, both of them staring at their reflections in the polished marble floor. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "your badge." Lisa touched the new ID card clipped to her blazer, another gift from Mr. Thompson's team, along with a professional wardrobe that had appeared in their new apartment's closets. Director of Nursing Operations, Lisa read quietly, tracing the letters with her finger. "I still can't believe it." A familiar figure strode across the lobby toward them. "Ms. Johnson," James called out. "Mr. Thompson is waiting." They followed him to a private elevator. Sarah watched the numbers climb. 10, 20, 30. The city spread out below them through the glass walls, growing smaller with each floor. "Sarah," her mother said suddenly, "your shoes are untied." Sarah looked down at her new sneakers, Nikes, like Madison's, though she hadn't asked for them. They'd simply appeared with the rest of the clothes. The elevator stopped at the 70th floor. James led them through a suite of offices to a set of wooden doors that probably cost more than their old apartment's yearly rent. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing for them to enter. Mr. Thompson sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a dining table. No wheelchair now, just a powerful man in his element. But when he smiled, Sarah saw the same kindness from the street corner. "The Johnson ladies." He stood, coming around the desk. "Lisa, that blazer suits you perfectly." "Mr. Thompson," Lisa began. "I don't know how to thank Dash." He held up a hand. "Stop right there. No thanks needed. In fact," he pressed a button on his desk. "Send her in, please." The door opened, and Sarah's breath caught. Madison Thompson walked in, wearing her private school uniform and a confused expression. "Grandpa," she said, then spotted Sarah. "What's she doing here?" "Madison." Mr. Thompson's voice carried a warning. "This is Lisa Johnson, our new director of nursing operations. And you already know her daughter, Sarah." Madison's face flushed. "But she's their what?" Mr. Thompson asked quietly. "The owners of a 3-year-old flip phone? The people who can't afford Apple Watches." He stepped closer to his granddaughter. "Or are they the ones who show real character when no one important is watching?" The silence stretched taut as a wire. Madison stared at her shoes, designer brands. Sarah noticed, probably worth a month of her mother's old salary. "Sarah," Mr. Thompson continued, "did you know Madison has never worked a day in her life? Never had to worry about bills, or help her parents, or make difficult choices? Grandpa, that's not fair. Madison protested. No, it's not fair. Just like it wasn't fair when you mocked Sarah's phone, or when you laughed at her clothes. He turned to Sarah. Did she ever tell you about her father? My son? Sarah shook her head. He's in Tokyo right now. Or maybe Paris. He travels so much, buys her so many things, but never stops to really see her. Mr. Thompson's voice softened. Just like those executives never stopped to see me in that wheelchair. Madison's lower lip trembled. I didn't think, didn't care. Mr. Thompson sighed. Madison, do you know why Sarah's mother has her new position? Because Sarah helped you cross the street, Madison muttered. No, because Sarah showed the kind of character I want in this company. The kind of person I want you to become. Tears spilled down Madison's cheeks. Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to be called out in front of others. Mr. Thompson, she said quietly, maybe Madison and I could talk? Alone? Everyone turned to look at her. Madison with surprise, her mother with pride, Mr. Thompson with a knowing smile. An excellent suggestion. He gestured to a small conference room. Take all the time you need. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Sarah sat at the glass table, watching Madison sink into a chair opposite her. I'm sorry, Madison blurted out. About your phone? And everything. It's okay, Sarah said, and was surprised to find she meant it. You didn't know, but I should have. Madison wiped her eyes. Grandpa's right. I never think about how other people live. Sarah thought about her mother's late nights, about counting eggs in the fridge, about walking in her shoes just right to hide the worn soles. It's not your fault, she said finally. You can't know what you haven't experienced. Madison looked up, mascara smudged under her eyes. Are you being nice to me? After how I treated you? Sarah remembered Mr. Thompson in his wheelchair, smiling despite being ignored by hundreds. Because being kind costs nothing. My mom taught me that. Your mom? Madison hesitated. She's going to be working with my dad. When he's actually here. Is he gone a lot? Madison nodded, fresh tears falling. He thinks presents make up for it. Like this watch. She touched the Apple Watch on her wrist. I'd rather have him home for dinner. Sarah thought about her own father, who hadn't even left presents behind. At least he tries, she offered. In his way. Yeah. Madison managed a weak smile. Hey, since your mom's working here now, maybe we could have lunch together sometimes? At school? Sarah remembered all the times Madison's group had laughed at her in the cafeteria. But she also remembered her grandmother's words about forgiveness. I'd like that, she said. But no making fun of my phone. Madison actually laughed. Deal. And Sarah? Thank you. For helping my grandfather. For being better than me? Not better, Sarah corrected. Just different. With different experiences. A knock at the door made them both turn. James stood there, his usual stoic expression softened slightly. Ladies, Mr. Thompson would like to show you something. They followed him back to the main office, where Mr. Thompson and Lisa stood by a large screen showing a hospital floor plan. Ah, good timing. Mr. Thompson beamed. Madison, Sarah, how would you like to help design our new pediatric ward? Both girls stared at him. What? Madison asked. Lisa had an excellent suggestion about making our children's wing more welcoming. I thought who better to help than actual young people. He clicked through some designs. Of course, you need to work together. Sarah caught her mother's eye and saw her own hope reflected there. Hope for change, for understanding, for bridges built between their different worlds. I'd like that, she said, and Madison nodded. Me too, Grandpa. Mr. Thompson smiled, looking more like the man in the wheelchair than the CEO. Excellent. Now, Lisa, about those staffing changes. Sarah stood by the window, watching boats move across the harbor far below. Madison joined her, their reflections overlapping in the glass. Everything's different now, Madison said quietly. Sarah thought about their new apartment, her mother's badge, the future stretching out before them. Different, but not unrecognizable. Different can be good, she replied. 1 month later, Sarah walked through the automatic doors of Boston General's pediatric ward, a box of art supplies under her arm. The walls, once stark white, now bloomed with colorful murals. the result of her and Madison's weekend design sessions. "Sarah," a nurse called out, waving. "The kids are waiting in the playroom." It still felt strange, being known here, being welcomed. A month ago, she'd only seen this hospital when dropping off her mother's forgotten lunch or phone. The playroom door burst open, and 6-year-old Tommy rolled his wheelchair into the hallway. "Sarah's here," he shouted, his 4-pole trailing behind him. Inside voice, remember? Sarah grinned, ruffling his hair as she passed. This was her new after-school routine, volunteering in the pediatric ward while her mother attended management meetings upstairs. Mr. Thompson had suggested it, but the idea had been Sarah's, making sure other kids weren't invisible just like she'd been. Madison was already in the playroom, helping a little girl with leukemia paint a butterfly. She looked up and waved, paint smudged on her private school uniform. "Dad's coming home tomorrow," she announced as Sarah set up the art supplies. "He wants to see what we've done with the ward." Sarah nodded, remembering how Madison's father had called from Dubai last week, actually listening as his daughter excitedly described their project. "Small changes, but real ones." "Miss Sarah?" Tommy tugged at her sleeve. "Can you help me make something for my mom? She has to work tonight." "Of course." Sarah pulled out colored paper and markers. "What does she do?" "She's a cleaner at the mall." Tommy looked down. "We don't have much money for presents." Sarah caught Madison watching them, saw understanding flash across her former bully's face. "Hey, Tommy," Madison called out, "want to use my special glitter pens? They make everything look magical." Tommy's face lit up as Madison shared her expensive art supplies, something the old Madison would never have done. The afternoon passed in a blur of art projects and children's laughter. At 5 o'clock, Lisa appeared in the doorway, looking professional in her new role, but still warmly familiar. "Ready to go, honey? Mr. Thompson's car is waiting." Sarah began packing up the supplies. A month in, and it still felt surreal. The daily rides home, the fully stocked fridge, the quiet apartment where they could both sleep through the night without hearing neighbors through the walls. "Mom," Tommy called out as they left. "Look what I made." Sarah paused in the doorway, watching Tommy proudly show his mother the glitter-covered card. The cleaning woman's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her son, her uniform wrinkled from a long day's work. "Sarah?" Her mother touched her shoulder. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Sarah said softly. "Just thinking." They walked to the elevator together, passing the newly decorated walls. Children's artwork hung in proper frames now, not just taped to the walls. Every piece labeled, every young artist acknowledged. "Mr. Thompson wants to meet with us," Lisa said as they descended. "Both of us." The elevator opened to reveal James waiting in the lobby. He'd stopped being quite so formal around them, though his suits remained impeccable. "Ladies," he nodded, leading them to the familiar black SUV. The ride to Thompson Healthcare's headquarters was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah watched the city scroll past, remembering that first day, that crucial moment when she'd chosen to stop and help. Mr. Thompson's office was warm with late afternoon sun. He sat in his wheelchair today, something he did occasionally now, especially when meeting with patients or families. "Ah, the Johnsons." He wheeled himself around the desk. "I wanted to show you something." He pressed a button, and a video began playing on the wall screen. Security footage, Sarah realized from that day on the street. She watched herself stop, watched hundreds pass by, watched the moment that had changed everything. "I've shown this video to every executive in the company," Mr. Thompson said. "Required viewing now." Along with this, the screen changed to show the pediatric ward. Children laughing, parents smiling, walls bright with artwork. Tommy proudly showing his mother the card. "This is what healthcare should be," Mr. Thompson continued. "Not just treating illnesses, but seeing people. Really seeing them." He wheeled closer to Sarah. "You know, when I planned that little test on the street, I expected to prove how cold the world had become. Instead, you proved something else." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "That one person choosing kindness can change everything." He smiled. "Madison told me about Tommy's mother, about the art supplies." Sarah felt her face warm. It wasn't anything special, but it was... Mr. Thompson's voice grew serious. "A month ago, Madison would never have shared her precious glitter pens. A month ago, that woman would have cleaned our offices without anyone knowing her name, her story, her struggles. Lisa stepped forward. The changes in the hospital are just the beginning. Mr. Thompson grinned, which is why I wanted to meet. How would you both feel about expanding the program? Other hospitals, other cities? Sarah's breath caught. You mean? Sometimes it takes a child to remind us what matters. To show us how to be human again. He pulled out 2 folders. Lisa, I want you to head up our new community care initiative. And Sarah, me? How would you like to make this official? Paid position, training other young volunteers, helping design programs for children's wards across the country. Sarah looked at her mother, saw tears in her eyes. Of course, Mr. Thompson added, school comes first. And Madison has already volunteered to be your assistant. A knock at the door revealed Madison herself, practically bouncing with excitement. Did you tell them? About the other hospitals? I just did. Mr. Thompson watched as Madison rushed to hug Sarah. Someone once told me that kindness costs nothing, but means everything. Your grandmother, wasn't it, Sarah? Sarah nodded, remembering all her grandmother's lessons about helping others, about seeing people, about the true value of things money couldn't buy. She would be proud, Lisa said softly. Of both of us? Sarah looked around the office, at Madison's genuine smile, at her mother's confident posture, at Mr. Thompson in his wheelchair that had started it all. She thought about Tommy and his mother, about all the other families struggling like they once had, about the chance to help make their battles a little easier. So, Mr. Thompson said, what do you say? Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the opportunity, the responsibility, the chance to keep choosing kindness every single day. When do we start? Mr. Thompson's smile was answer enough. Outside his windows, the sun set over Boston, painting the sky in colors as bright as Tommy's glitter card. Sarah thought about the long path that had led here, from a street corner where she'd stopped to help, to this moment where stopping had become starting something new. You know, Madison said as they left the office later, my dad asked me what I wanted for my birthday next week. Another Apple Watch? Sarah teased. Madison shook her head. I told him I want to volunteer at the Children's Hospital in Tokyo next time he goes. Together, Sarah felt something warm bloom in her chest, pride, maybe, or hope, or maybe just the simple joy of knowing that kindness, once given, had a way of growing, spreading, changing not just moments but lives. Tomorrow, there would be more children to help, more walls to paint, more stories to hear and acknowledge. Tomorrow, her mother would lead meetings about putting humanity back into healthcare. Tomorrow, Madison's father would board a plane home instead of away. But right now, in this moment, Sarah simply smiled and said what her grandmother would have said. What she'd finally learned was the truest thing of all. Sometimes the smallest choices make the biggest changes. Yeah, Madison agreed. And sometimes helping someone cross the street means learning how to cross bridges yourself. They walked to the elevator together, 2 girls from different worlds who'd found common ground in the simple act of seeing others, of being seen, of choosing over and over again to stop and help. And somewhere on a Boston street corner, hundreds still rushed past, too busy to notice what Sarah had learned. That the true value of a person had nothing to do with what they owned, and everything to do with whether they chose to stop, to see, to care. That was the real gift Mr. Thompson had given them all. Not money or jobs or opportunities, but the chance to prove that in a world of rushing past, someone could still choose to stop. Someone could still choose to help. Someone could still choose to change everything.